Welcome to this special edition of Poetic Lines. Witnessing the landscape has always been important to poet Lauren Camp, who grew up in the suburbs of Manhattan but has lived in New Mexico for the past 30 years. Lauren was named Poet Laureate of New Mexico in 2022. Lauren's story is so rich and surprising that I want to begin with some poems from her new book and then look back at earlier aspects of her unexpected adventures with poetry. In Old Sky, her 8th collection, was published this April by Grand Canyon Conservancy. The poems reflect the experience she had while spending a month in Grand Canyon, exploring the park's pristine natural darkness and night phenomena. They also convey the vast power of the canyon itself. We'll hear 2 of those poems, which she read during an online event called The Darkness, Poetry, and the Stars, hosted by Grand Canyon Conservancy.
I came to the canyon not as a scientist, but as a poet, working with data sets of attention. The task I set for myself in the month I was there was to craft natural darkness into language. And what better place to do so than the Grand Canyon with its pristine darkness? I spent the month of August 2022, just over a year ago, at the canyon, hiking and experiencing with all my senses. I was out primarily at dusk and deep into dark. And I'd like to read you a few of the many poems I drafted, many poems I drafted while I was there. I think I wrote about 45 or so poems while I was there, which is a lot for me. I think it might be a lot for anybody, I'm not sure. And they all circled around dark and stars and different ways I could come at light pollution and the canyon. And each time my task was to find a new way to say it, a new angle, new language, new perspective, anything. This poem is called Bluest. All those years seeking resplendence, how deceived my longing has been. Memories muscled as otters. Where the center is always discernible, I am reminded courage is billions of years earlier than we are. And loss is held like a rudder. Little dear, imagine there is a space to forgive ourselves. Imagine the slow, intimate unknitting of earth, the sky in its steam and pleasure. How will I greet you when I am back? The spectrum not yet diminished in me. Arena. The sky is out again, galloping on its inherited ribbon. It's so easy to stand under it. The whole pulse of the world, the dead stars, clouds slinking around, thinking rain, thinking landless, then giving up on that and wandering slow with the thought of tomorrow. And I realize the sky must love to drape itself with fancy signals and ceremonies, must love its tight squeezes and overlapped spines, and it's nothing. Everyone is watching. Everyone here has a reason to visit this place serrated with mountains and praised as pristine. And I am amidst them, bathing in their overlapped languages, saying the last time, or next time, or day's end, or all the places we've ever been acquainted with night. It's a pleasure to be undisciplined about our waiting. Raven staccato to prove another whole day ghosts. The sky is so good at knowing how to be endless. I want to tell the truth. Even tonight, sitting on the edge, nothing much happened in front and in my peripheral vision. In this one deep field of time, my only self-portrait was breath. What do I know
Now that you've heard about Lauren's fascinating new project and have enjoyed some of her new poems, let's go back to the start of her story. Lauren's life journey is fascinating in part because she came to poetry through visual art. From 1996 to 2008, she had a flourishing career as a visual artist. Her portrait series, The Fabric of Jazz, traveled to museums in 10 cities. Her artwork was also displayed in cultural centers, hospitals, museums, U.S. embassies, and other organizations around the world. For 15 years, she was also a producer and host for Santa Fe Public Radio. Since then, she has published 8 books, and her poems have been translated into Turkish, Mandarin, Arabic, and Spanish. Her awards include an Academy of American Poets Fellowship Laureate, a Dorset Prize, and a finalist citation for the Arab American Book Award. When I interviewed Lauren after the publication of her 6th book, Took House, she shared unforgettable comments about her journey, revision, and embracing new landscapes. We join that conversation now. Lauren, welcome to the show. Would you read us a poem from Took House?
The night clouds wrestled the sky. At that moment, I was blind to the sorrow and stop that was coming. For that gentle hour, I settled into the only split in the road, where I still saw the purple reflection of day slipping from cedar and aspen. Air temperature as skin would shift to bare and brisk, but in the sky, unguarded orange shadows advanced and clouds extended to unkempt corners, the desert's chambers of gray. Trees unfurled their fluted, 5-petaled, veined fingers, precision worth noting. What else should we look at but fugitive color, the shape that's not empty? So little of what happens belongs to us, only the frequent sense of being encircled. After light was stripped from the scarlet wall, a string of birds armed long branches, rhapsodizing. I had entered the chatter curved worship of their bursting, the song grafted to the moon's musky discipline. Once their noise was placed, it remained in my mind for years. Not a coincidence that I heard and saw a final stray sweep of sun as pigment and chord, and would summon it again next time I was swallowed, beat down. That night the sky came up to my lips. It tasted of wind and gave me something to miss.
That is a beautiful poem with wonderful sounds. What made you decide to read that one?
Well, the poem comes early in the collection, so it sort of begins to set up what's coming later, or at least hint at what's coming later in the book. But also it brings in some of the things that I care a lot about. Landscape, writing about place and where I am, which I do a lot, but also visual art, or visual seeing, maybe. At the time that I began writing this collection, I was still very much working as a visual artist. By the time I had finished, 15 years later with the book or thereabouts, I had put aside the visual art and was focused completely on poetry. But early on in the collection, in the writing of the poems, I had my hands in my medium, moving things around, pattern and color and texture, and finding ways to put those together. And then I would go over to the poetry and do that same thing, that same kind of motion with the words, finding the texture of the words in the best shapes and composition. The medium that I worked in primarily was fabric and thread. So I was making wall hangings of typically 2-dimensional work, but not always. The tools I used were very simple. They were my scissors, fabric, and my sewing machine, and that's about it. The subjects that I was dealing in were either abstractions, abstract color play, or jazz music, or portraits of women and a series of women. So those were my main topics. I don't know if I could say I began switching over to poetry. I pulled poetry in to sort of go alongside the artwork early on. I was writing little statements to go with my work so that when it was on exhibit, they would have these statements next to it. The museums and exhibit places requested it, and I just wrote what I felt like, which turned out to be kind of poetry, though I didn't know it.
When you write a poem, do you start with an image, an idea, or a sound?
Sometimes I start with something I've seen or something I've heard that I want to hold on to. I think I start with something I need to work through, and that might be something I've seen that's problematic, or something that has happened or that I have done that is wonderful or troubling that I need to figure out and about in the world. But I would say they all start differently, but usually it's something I want to hold and turn around in some ways, or walk around and explore from different angles.
That makes perfect sense. And I share that feeling because often when I write, I'm trying to figure something out, a gnawing question or idea, something I just can't put into words.
A really nice place to begin from, because you don't go in with an ending in mind. You don't go in knowing where you're getting to. And I like that idea of um, not, and I like this in art also, of not having to create something that I can already see fully in my mind, something that is already fully developed. I'm not interested in that. What I want to do is figure it out, is discover something, is see how it actually shows up. So when I was making portraits of jazz musicians, if I could like work it up on my computer so I could see all the colors and patterns, I had no reason to make it because I could already tell what the finished result was going to be. It's just like that in poetry. I want to start somewhere and not know what it's going to become.
I think a lot of people feel that way, and it impacts the experience of readers because we get to go along that journey with you.
For me, it's a fun place to be as a writer, because there isn't pressure to get to that right place, because I don't know what that right place is. So there's just a big amount of freedom where I get to follow a line of poetry, a line of thought, add something new in, see what happens, see where I get to, now look around and figure it out again. I don't know, it's so appealing to me. It's freeing.
You worked in public radio for 15 years. How did you get into that field, and how did it impact your writing?
I loved public radio. I worked for our local public radio station as a jazz DJ for a long time, and then my show started to include other, like, world music and other genres of music. But in every single show that I did, I also included contemporary poetry and voiced poetry by other people. And that combination, like listening to, for myself as I was assembling the show, listening to the way the different musical tracks segued, or the music set up the poem, or the poem came out into some new music, all of that was part of it was a different form of composition. And at the same time I was doing that, I was a visual artist. So I had my visual composition, I had my sound compositions that I was doing every week and for the radio show. And I really fell into radio. It's some quirky story where somebody needed a substitute for our public radio station, and I got pulled in. I agreed without having any idea what I was doing. And then I ended up, after a bunch of training, behind a microphone and realizing that it was very suitable to me for all those years. So I stopped a couple of years ago to devote myself to teaching and to my own writing, but I loved it. I learned a lot because I'm self-taught as a poet, because I came to poetry through these two directions, through visual art and through the sound, through radio. I took those elements and put them into my poems. It seemed to me they worked for those two mediums, so why couldn't they work on the page? And I don't know that I could elucidate exactly how I translated, like how when I look at a poem, I see color or texture or the friction that I was looking for also in my artwork, or like I'm always looking for a little friction, honestly. I was always looking for things that would be smooth enough, but not exact. Things for colors that would go together, but not precisely.
I like that idea of friction. Does finding friction in a phrase or an idea wake you up as a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. And finding friction sometimes means, um, I mean, it can mean any kind of thing. It could mean putting in a little humor. Sometimes I read my poems aloud and I write about very heavy things mostly, but sometimes there's just this little quirky thing in the language that makes me crack up. Or, there's some word that I hear as I'm going about my day, or as I'm reading something else, as I'm reading a newspaper article, and I find some wonderful word for whatever reason. And my question of myself is, how can I work this word in somewhere, somewhere strange, somewhere where it's really surprising.
You live in New Mexico. How has your sense of the landscape changed during the pandemic?
Think it's deepened more than changed. I've had more steady time to look. I live on a dirt road in a rural farming village. I have long been writing about place, about where I am or where I travel to. But a year plus of being in the same place without going much further than the bottom of my hill or the hiking trail, a few miles away, is a chance to really see more closely, and maybe even to use some of the other senses that I only get to after a while. So to listen more carefully to the sound the ravens are making, um, as they're mating, or as they're flying, or what the sounds of anything late at night, at dusk, in the morning, just to start paying attention at all different times and in deeper ways. So I would say it's deepened more than changed. I write a lot about place under the most normal times, and these days that's my subject very often. That's my whole subject, is place.
You have also been writing a series of poems that would resonate with many readers. Would you tell us about that?
I Since 2015, I have been writing about my father and his, at first, small bits of memory loss, and then total sort of sinking. I don't love that word, but sort of settling into Alzheimer's disease. So memory being stripped away from him, his memories. And throughout the 4 years that I wrote the poems, and I wrote, well, at least 100, maybe well over 100, I wasn't really documenting specifically the trajectory of his memory loss, but I was noticing, I was witnessing, uh, I would, it was a kind of, um, it was a kind of allowing, or sort of almost worshiping of the ordinary, of whatever I saw that mattered to me. And I wasn't actively thinking this is going to matter to me later. It was just, this matters to me now. This adorable thing, this strange way he said this, the way that I got to like kneel down at his feet and put on his socks and help him that way. Whatever it was things I wanted to hold on to right then. And the writing of the poems, which I did the whole time, it wasn't fixing, it was not at all fixing the problem. It wasn't a way to control the Alzheimer's, the memory loss. It was only a way for me to have something I could do aside from watching things slip away. It was a pleasure in a sad sort of way. And anyway, I've written well over 100 poems, and during the pandemic, I finally got brave enough to narrow down the poems and put them together into a collection, into a manuscript, to decide which were right, which were good, which I wanted together. Things. My dad, in the process, he died in 2019, just almost 2 years ago exactly. In the process of losing bits of his memory, he softened a lot. He became vulnerable and gentler and really very loving. And so it was very easy to want to hold some very beautiful small things as memory. I miss my dad all the time, but I miss certain things. I even miss I miss his complications. I miss the ways he would call me early on in his forgetting, because I was his problem solver, and I'd pick up the phone and he'd be crazed about something. He'd be so upset about something, and it was my job to settle him down. And I miss everything, but it was nice to be able in every poem to not be writing some global treatise on dementia, but just this moment, just where we are now in this poem, in this particular place.
As I think about your poetry, the words serendipity and courage come to mind. How do those elements impact you?
Courage feels like a very generous word to be given. So thank you for that. I think courage for me in poetry is in the revision process, and it's no longer a kind of courage. Now I've set it up as a kind of habit, as a kind of, here my process is multi-layered. It does not happen all at once. So what might seem like courage to go back in and revise to someone is not courage to me. I'm not there yet. I have to do this. I have students that come to me sometimes and say, I've already written this 3 times. And I think, that's nothing. That's, you're starting, you're just getting started, do a few more. But I think that's where courage, I don't know, I think that's where courage started for me in poetry. But maybe courage is just trying something at all, writing poetry before I knew what it was. And that's slightly embarrassing to say, because I was an adult when I had to when people were saying, your poems are terrific. And I would say, I don't write poems. So what are you talking about? And then figuring out, well, maybe I could. What is this? Maybe I'm doing it. Serendipity, I think I do all over the place. I think serendipity is in my nature to just, I'm in the desert because of serendipity. I own my house because of serendipity. I'm, like every decision I've made in my life is just sort of, is both this is really a good decision for this present moment, and a serendipitous decision, most of which have worked out, which is really lucky.
I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, but we are almost out of time. Would you read another poem for us?
It's been such a pleasure. I want to read a poem about my dad, about the memory loss, which is none of the poems I think are, they all have a tinge of sadness, and there's not much I can do about that because it's a devastating disease. But this poem has a title that bridges right into the poem. It is not easy to live in many universes. This morning, I wanted to see my father on my sister's phone screen, wanted to show him the street of my smile, but his mind was full of its almonds. The day concentrated its heat, a merciless rectangular room. When I was a girl, my father could wreck an intention, his anger a gash, and now, defenseless, clear days when we are beautiful faces. What he supposes we are. Scientists use mouse models to understand the disorder. I am the wise one, the fearful one. I read more about mice. Sometimes I tell my father we're rich on bread and orchids. I tell him what is a garden, a harbor. Rather than grief, a question starts at the end. I maze through the latest statistics and spend further hours with a broom and a teapot. General disintegration. Yesterday in a doctor's office, I saw a photo in National Geographic of rhinos. Through long windows, the ecstatic sunshine came into view. I sat in this tired body, looked at the rhinos. Some men had cut off the horns. I will care about everything. Those mysterious mammals, those mammoth gaps in their heads. My father is losing his mind, and all the things I know right now are what a hole can do, how that hole keeps being empty.
That is powerful and heartbreaking, absolutely gorgeous, because you have captured both his struggle and his humanity. Thank you for sharing your wonderful poems, your compassion, and for your keen insights about seeing and what it means to reconsider the landscape.
Thank you, Elizabeth. What a pleasure.
Thanks for watching Poetic Lines, where writers make the language sing. If you enjoyed this episode, come back next month for another in-depth conversation about the power and delight of language and how poetry can enhance people's lives. Have an idea about a possible topic or guest? Send me a message through my website, poeticlines.net.